When you think about this moment with Donald Trump, did you ever think you would see such a thing?
Not in such naked, unglossed intensity that a man of such manifest incompetence and Herculean ignorance would be at the helm of the ship of state, and it's pretty depressing. It's pretty remarkable. But given the kind of person I am and the kind of people from whom I hail, I should say, you got to figure out the good consequences of that. And one of them is to understand that in many ways, Donald Trump is the manifestation of what Black people have warned America about in regard to whiteness for like 300 years. This is what racism looks like. This is how it happens. This is what it does to you. It's incoherent often. It's narcissistic. It's self-preoccupied. It's irrational. It comes at you in such gusts and waves of hostility that it's hard to manage. It knocks you off kilter and you try to stand back up to fight it. This is what a lot of America is feeling in the aftermath of Donald Trump's presidency. And he's not an aberration from whiteness, so to speak. He's an extension of the logic of what that is at its base. So that's one of the good things. And then the second thing is to remind ourselves that this is by far not the worst thing to ever happen, though it's pretty bad. That when you look back at history, Civil War, enslavement, Jim Crow, and a host of ills, that as bad as Donald Trump is, he ain't the worst thing to happen. So let's put the brakes on and figure out how to handle him and move beyond him when we can finally get past devastation he's wreaking.
For Black and brown folks, whiteness is terror. But white folks historically imagine themselves as benign and inherently good by virtue of their skin color and given societies in the West what it means to be white. And I've been giving a lot of talks saying, hey, Donald Trump, number one, is the perfect embodiment, number one, of human mediocrity. But he is the living embodiment of white male privilege and toxic white masculinity. That's number one. And number two, I've sort of soured on trying to talk to our white brothers and sisters about either questions of the color line, white supremacy, trying to get rid of that language. My new tack is not a new one. I'm sure others have done it too, is here's how racism hurts you. So Donald Trump is a great example because he's a political sadist of using racism to hurt our white brothers and sisters. But unfortunately, he's the second most popular Republican in the era of modern polling. He's remarkably popular among all white voters. He won every category of white voters except college-educated white women who slightly went for Hillary. How can we reach out to our white brothers and sisters, frankly, who should know better?
Well, that's true. Take a page from Stacey Abrams, who's running for governor in Georgia. She ain't reaching out to them. She's reaching out to the people who believe what she believes. And she thinks they're strong enough, and enough of them, to put her in office. Look at what happened with Doug Jones in Alabama. Now, I use a political example deliberately to contradistinct to and juxtapose against the powerful cultural social logic that you just expressed. Because on the one hand, trying to convince white folk that this stuff is evil has been fruitless. To convince them that it's against their best interest hasn't been very successful, because they continue to vote for people who are not at all helpful for their condition. Martin Luther King Jr. was in jail in Birmingham, and his jailers came to him and said, "Doctor, integration is wrong and segregation is right." He said, "No, that's not true." He argued with them. Then he asked, "How much money do you make?" And when they told him, he said, "Hell, you need to be out here marching with us." So the thing is, even when it's not in their own interests, many white brothers and sisters continue to pull that lever, dimple that shad, and cast a vote for the person who is, they think, despite not being in their interest, is in their ultimate interest, which is the psychological wage that whiteness pays. This is what Du Bois talked about in 1935, right? In Black Reconstruction. So the psychological wage is what they accumulate. It's what they're paid in. It's the coin of the realm of white supremacy. So trying to convince white folk that it ain't in their interest is still worth it to a degree. Trying to show them the horror and the utter trauma that is visited upon them when they embrace a figure like Trump is fruitless, because what they get in compensation for voting for him is the feeling that he's speaking for them. He's amplifying them. He's echoing their xenophobia, their insecurity about the borders and how their jobs will do in the aftermath. He's echoing their belief that Black people and brown people and others are benefiting from something they shouldn't be benefiting from. So when he brings that kind of psychological advantage to the plate, it's hard for us to swing successfully against white people cooperating with their own oppression, so to speak, or at least the worsening of their conditions. The best thing is to put our best cards on the table, talk about what helps this nation most, organize with who do believe that, because there are enough white people out there, along with other people of color and others, who are tired of Trump. And they might not be tired of him for the same reason we're tired of him, but if all of us are tired of him together, then we can learn, band together, right? So that the anti-racists and the environmentalists and even conscientious Republicans who are fiscal conservatives but are tolerant socially, on and on, if those people come together and say we have in common an enemy to all of our interests, then we learn to get over our pet peeves. We learn to get beyond some of our own bigotries and blindnesses and figure out a way to together forge connection and build alliance that will allow this country to survive. But appealing to the consciences of white Americans, as Dr. King did, it works to a small degree, but not nearly as successfully as it did during his day. And furthermore, I think in trying to get white people to see that this stuff is illogical, irrational, and that Donald Trump is, as I've said, the fleshly thesaurus of every white inclination to be oblivious to its own privilege, then, what we've got to do is to continue to point out just how bad things are. And now maybe for the first time, white brothers and sisters can see in his face, in his body, through his actions, as a result of his governance, just how horrible whiteness in general is. So don't make this an exception. Don't make Donald Trump an aberration. Make him the extension of the logic. Make him the fulfillment of the apotheosis of white privilege, white racism, white tyranny, white terror, white supremacy, right? Put all that stuff out there.
So we're having a moment of kismet. So help me work an internal contradiction, a dualism, a tension. So on one hand, none of this is at all surprising because Donald Trump is the result of deep, deep, deep problems in this country that have been lingering for centuries. So we can talk about genocide against First Nations people, the enslavement, rape, murder, exploitation of black and brown folks, especially African Americans from the Middle Passage to the present. But then, on the other hand, part of me is like, okay, we understand he's an American fascist, the representation of this deep malignancy in this country, but then perhaps repackaged for the reality TV show, professional wrestling, celebrity-obsessed era. Part of this is just a reckoning, because America has been due for a reckoning for a very, very, very long time, and maybe Trump is it. So part of me is surprised, but the other part of me is like, hey, this is expected.
There it is. I mean, between those two things, surprise and expectation. Surprise because it's such a blatant expression of racial narcissism, right? And the collective instinct of whiteness to, have a bunker mentality and to protect itself from knowing and being responsible for the horrors that whiteness brings. So there's the reinvestment in white racial innocence as a protection against, as a hedge against, as a kind of psychological and social prophylactic against the conception of their own complicity in what we see going on. If we can just put it on him, it's him, not us. But no, it's us. It's the collective whiteness that's at stake here, because they would like to exempt themselves from the specific species and variety of white animus that they see going on there. But no, this y'all. This your baby. He was fed on lies, mythologies, the accreted mendacity of a white culture that will not confront its erosion and its own corruption and its own participation in some of the most tragic